is the guest speaker at a meeting of the Wichita, Kansas Rotary Club. James Woosley discusses the role of the CIA in a post-Cold War era and stressed the importance of a more flexible intelligence agency. After his remarks, the director took questions from the audience on a variety of topics, including NATO and the U.S. role in Bosnia.
Well, thanks to David and the Rotarians for allowing us this opportunity. We're indeed fortunate. You know, the prior director of the CIA was from Wichita. The current director is from Tulsa. And so we have this close to home. The two former chairmen of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees were from Oklahoma, and the current one on the House is from Kansas. So we like to think that our part of the country perhaps has a little premium on intelligence of all sorts. Of course, when I was appointed chairman of the Intelligence Committee, people thought that that was an oxymoron, congressional intelligence, but I'm sure nobody in this room thinks that way at all. I'm honored to have Jim Woosley here to speak to us. We just came from Wichita State, where he spoke at a forum board meeting, and there were about 500 people there, students and people in the community who came to listen. And one of the things I have done since I've become chairman is to try to get the intelligence community to kind of pull itself out of this shroud of Cold War secrecy. Where it can be done, the people need to know what the intelligence community does. I mean, they spend billions and billions of your dollars every year trying to do their best to give good information to the President of the United States and to Congress and policymakers. And it need not be shrouded in this kind of secrecy that we saw during the Cold War. And one of the things that the director is doing is to go out and tell folks a little bit about what it is that intelligence is all about in an attempt to try to demystify it, because in my judgment, while the defense and intelligence budgets are being scaled down to some degree, intelligence is very important to this country, is an important force multiplier in making sure that policymakers know what's happening in the rest of the world. As I said, Jim is a native of Tulsa, Oklahoma. He went to Stanford University. He was awarded a Rhodes Scholar and went to Oxford. That sounds vaguely familiar with somebody who's in the White House today. But he was also in the U.S. Army. He was an advisor. I tell you, no matter how I try, I just step into it all the time. He was an advisor to the U.S. delegation on the SALT talks, arms limitation talks. He's been general counsel to the U.S. Senate Committee on Armed Services. He was back as a negotiator in Europe, appointed in 1989 by the previous administration to represent the U.S. on the conventional forces in Europe talks, which resulted in significant reductions in weapons between the United States and the Soviet Union. He's got many activities. The most important activity, of course, now is he's Director of Central Intelligence, which means that he not only heads up the CIA, but also is basically the chairman of the board responsible for all intelligence activities, whether it's a national security agency and the activities in the Department of Defense in terms of including military intelligence and the like. So it's a monumental task, particularly one that's occurring at a time when the world is changing so dramatically and radically. So you didn't come to hear me, you came to hear him, and I know you're going to be pleased when you hear what he has to say, so I'd like you all to welcome Jim Woosley, Director of Central Intelligence.
Thanks, Dan. Let me just say, as a preliminary matter, I came into this job almost exactly a year ago, and Dan took over the chairmanship of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence a year ago. We've both kind of learned the intelligence business together, and it has been a real pleasure working with him. We've seen most things eye to eye, and on those occasions where we haven't, sometimes it's taken me a few days, sometimes it's taken me a few weeks, sometimes it's taken me a few months to come around. He's a very persuasive gentleman, especially because he's got my money. So, let me talk for just a few minutes and use the rest of the time for your questions about what is new about intelligence in the post-Cold War era. I've said on a couple of occasions, and I'm sorry to bore you with the metaphor if you've heard it before, but I do think it's descriptive. It's almost as if we had been struggling with a dragon for 40, 45 years, finally killed it, the Soviet Union, and then found ourselves in a jungle full of a lot of poisonous and rather camouflaged snakes. And in a lot of ways, the dragon was easier to keep track of. The Soviet Union did certain things in relatively predictable ways. It tried to infiltrate movements in the Third World in the same way. It made decisions in somewhat the same way. It died in a rather inventive and unique manner. But much of the way it lived and tried to exert its influence was somewhat regularized. The same thing is not true of Iran, Iraq, North Korea, Libya today. The same thing is not true of regional crises such as that in the Balkans. The same thing is not true of the international narcotics trade. The same thing is not true of the ingenious ways foreign corporations and foreign intelligence services and governments seek to bribe their way to contracts that American companies lose because American companies play by the rules. There are lots of new things that need to be looked at from the point of view of the United States' interests. I'm going to mention just a few, then talk a little bit about procedurally how things are different for us, and let you come back with questions on the substantive issues that you're interested in. One issue that has come to be front and center for us over the course of the last several months is North Korea. North Korea is embarked on a development program for nuclear weapons. It's not entirely clear, nor is it unanimously viewed within the U.S. intelligence community exactly how far they are along in that effort, but the weight of the judgment is that they have at least the fissionable material to have in hand enough for perhaps one nuclear weapon. They have also been engaged in a substantial conventional military buildup over the course of a number of years. And the general situation on the Korean Peninsula as a result of that, I think I would have to say, is something that has moved very much to the top of our intelligence agenda. Russia is, of course, in the throes of a very difficult transition. President Yeltsin won a new constitution for the Russian people in the elections last December, an important development, a constitution that has a very strong executive, stronger in constitutional terms than the American president's position and even stronger than the French president's position. It's a very strong executive constitution. And he is, we believe, going to try to proceed with the economic reforms that he and his advisors have been embarked upon before. But needless to say, the result of the elections in Russia in December have produced a degree of uncertainty about the pace of that reform, and particularly a concern that if subsidies continue in very large measure to some Russian industries, collective farms, and the rest, the printing of money will drive the inflation rate for the ruble up from the 10-12% per month, which is high enough, where it has been toward the end of 1993 up to the range of 20-30% per month, which verges on the type of hyperinflation which has produced serious social consequences in other countries at other times. It is definitely something that we all have to keep our eyes on. The situation with respect to Latin America and much of East Asia and the Pacific region, except for North Korea, I would say looks relatively sunny to us right now. Perhaps not entirely bright. There are such phenomena as the drug trade in Southeast Asia, the Khmer Rouge, and the like. But generally speaking, in much of Latin America, in Asia and the Pacific, the trend outside North Korea is viewed, I suppose, somewhere between relatively light gray and bright by much of the intelligence community. The same is not necessarily true in the Mideast. Although the agreement in the Rose Garden continues to hold out the promise for a settlement between Israel and its enemies in the Near East, the continued efforts by Iran, Iraq, and Libya particularly to be the recipients of weapons of mass destruction and the ballistic missiles to carry them, and at least the technology, therefore, from other countries, and to be engaged in various types of terrorist enterprises creates an extraordinarily difficult circumstance, I think, for all of us, because this combined problem of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and terrorism is something which creates not some abstract foreign policy problem for the United States in a vague or ideal sense. It creates a public safety problem for everyone in this room and for your friends and relatives here in Wichita, as well as throughout the United States, and certainly for our forces and friends and allies overseas. In addition to these new subjects and areas as the substance of what we are looking at, how do we look at it? Well, intelligence agencies in the United States, or frankly in any other country, really exist rather heavily to steal secrets from foreign countries and foreign entities, and to use those stolen secrets to analyze problems and issues of assistance to the leadership of the country. We are no different. I chair a intelligence community that operates satellites, that operates signals intercept communications gear of various types, and that runs agents, operates spies, in order to do really two or three things. First of all, to help the President, National Security Council, policymakers in the executive branch make assessments and understand what they need to do in order to try to preserve some of the remarkable positive steps, such as the end of the Soviet Union and the rest over the course of that have occurred over the course of the last several years, in order to help them stay ahead of emerging crises, whether it's in the Balkans or with respect to weapons of mass destruction or terrorism, and to take action whereby the United States can prevent things becoming worse or defeat adversaries as need be. We also are involved very intimately and directly in informing the Congress about these issues. The House committee, which Dan chairs, and its counterpart in the Senate, oversee our work in the intelligence community with in some detail and with, I might say, real professionalism and care. They are also, and their other colleagues in Congress, substantial consumers of intelligence. The CIA alone, which is just one of the several organizations in the intelligence community, is up on the Hill around 500 times a year, 3 or 4 times per legislative day, briefing members of Congress and their staffs on substantial intelligence issues. We now work very closely with military commanders. We work very closely with arms control negotiators, providing intelligence directly and immediately to them so that they can do their jobs better. As military forces shrink, it is particularly important for us to be able to provide intelligence, as Dan alluded to, as a force multiplier, to make it possible with a relatively few aircraft, let's say, and a relatively few cruise missiles, to do the kind of thing that was done in Baghdad under the president's decision last summer to retaliate against Saddam Hussein for the Iraqi government's involvement in the plot to try to assassinate former President Bush. In short, if we're going to have a limited number of precision-guided munitions and aircraft stationed overseas, they need to know exactly what window to put the cruise missiles into, and that's where we come in. What about the way in which we manage it? The U.S. intelligence community is multifaceted. There are 4 major agencies in the national programs, which I'm, as Dan said, sort of the chairman of the board of. The CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the National Reconnaissance Office that operates the satellites, and the National Security Agency that essentially does the code breaking. In addition to that, there are substantial undertakings in intelligence in the tactical forces in the Department of Defense. The military's intelligence work down at the division and wing level, for example, in the Army and the Air Force. Those efforts now, for the first time really, are being managed together by me and by the former Deputy Secretary of Defense, now Secretary of Defense, Bill Perry, in trying to bring about some degree of efficiency and elimination of overlap and duplication. This is something we would have been embarked on vigorously anyway, I think, but it was certainly heavily encouraged by the Congress and particularly by the House Committee in trying to make certain that we, in this amount of money that we have to spend on intelligence to have a worldwide intelligence system for the United States and its allies around the world, that we don't do it by unnecessary overlap and duplication. I say unnecessary duplication because some duplication is important and useful. In trying to understand what's going on in, for example, the North Korean effort to supply ballistic missiles to countries such as Iran and Libya, or in the North Korean nuclear program, or in the Iranian long-term military buildup. Those countries hide everything they do in the entire international web of their efforts in proliferation or terrorism behind many layers of secrecy. In order to understand what is going on, we don't just do it a single way or in a single predictable way. To put it in a short form, I guess I'd say spies tip off satellites and satellites tip off spies. The other aspect of duplication that has some important utility is that we need some degree of disagreement within the intelligence community. When you make mistakes is when you have one set of eyes, one office looking at a problem, and a point of view takes over that office or that group of people, and they head the wrong way. As in most things, debate, disagreement, a couple of 3 sets of eyes looking at the problem is important in intelligence just as it is in business or many other human undertakings. One of the things we've begun to do over the course of the last year that I'm quite proud of is we do not hide our disagreements in the intelligence community within the circle of those who see our estimates inside the government. We don't hide them by vague statements about it's more probable than not that such and such would be the case. We try to put numbers on what we can, and when we have disagreements, we display them, and we display the reasons for them, and we try to use the disagreements to teach the President and Dan Glickman and the other consumers of intelligence why there may be some disagreement and what thereby to help them understand better what actually may be going on out there in Iraq or Iran or North Korea, and help them better be able to make up their own minds and make their own decisions about it. In the aftermath of World War I, the United States withdrew from the world, and the consequences could be seen in the events a few years later of the mid and late 1930s and the Second World War that we had to fight. In the period after World War II, we had a momentary hesitation, but quite happily, under Harry Truman's leadership, we were able to come together and put together NATO, the Marshall Plan, Point 4, assistance to Greece and Turkey, all of the steps that made it possible for us to hold the line for 40, 45 long years, particularly in both Europe and Asia, to deter the expansion of communism and thereby ultimately to win the Cold War. We face a situation now in the world that is perhaps somewhat more analogous to the period before World War I or the period in the 1920s, except that the United States is a much more central player on the world scene. We face a situation in which there is a substantial degree of chaos, confusion, uncertainty in the world scene. A situation with a lot of heavily camouflaged and somewhat poisonous snakes. It is our job in the intelligence community on your behalf to try to help the President, the Congress, arms control negotiators, the military, make some sense out of that and to try to keep it from going the way some of the more horrible events of the 20th century have gone before. And with that, let me close and take your questions. Yes, sir.
Is the latest mortar attack in Sarajevo, in which we know 68 people at least died, enough to provoke the Clinton administration to use some of its newly found domestic political capital to really take the lead internationally in a military response?
Well, as you'll see from my elision in the last question, from policy into trying to describe the situation, let me be explicit about something with respect to this question, which is that I am not a policymaker. When I sit on the National Security Council as an advisor, the President or Tony Lake, depending on which type of a meeting it is, asks me for an intelligence assessment at the beginning. I comment throughout the meeting on the intelligence implications, on the factual situation, but when they go around the table to ask each person to make a recommendation about what our policy should be, they skip me. And that is entirely appropriate. The President told me that when he offered me the job. That has not always been the case with CIA directors, but it's been the case more often than not. And it seems to me that is the appropriate position for a Director of Central Intelligence to be in. We should not make recommendations about policy or speak publicly or, for that matter, privately on policy recommendations, because our sole job is to call them like we see them. That's what the President has asked me to do. That's what I've asked the employees of the CIA to do in written instructions, and that's what we do, which is to describe the situation and, insofar as we possibly can, and this certainly isn't always possible, predict what may or may not happen. But as far as making even a recommendation, much less a statement, of what the U.S. government policy ought to be with respect to actions in Bosnia or anywhere else, you have the wrong government official up here.
Don't you even have an assessment as the Director of Central Intelligence?
You asked me for an assessment of the American position. We don't do Americans. I'm not going to make an assessment of American positions. I'll talk to you if you want about what may be going on in Bosnia, but that's not the question you asked.
I would love to hear your description of what is going on in Bosnia.
All right, let me do the best I can. I think the fundamental reality of what has happened with the breakup of former Yugoslavia is that there has been substantial aggression by the Bosnian Serbs and to some extent by the Croats in Bosnia. And the government of Bosnia has not always, but on most circumstances, been the victim. There exists, partially as a result of the aggression, and partially as a result of ethnic and religious hatreds going back many centuries, a condition in Bosnia now in which the government forces have been somewhat gaining in both their military position and in their military strength. They've been doing it with great difficulty. They are heavily outgunned in terms of heavy weapons. They have very few tanks or artillery pieces, but in terms of their capability as light infantry equipped with machine guns and mortars, they are now coming to do a reasonably good job of fighting in several locales, both against the Croats and against the Bosnian Serbs. The situation with respect to whether the government of Bosnia or either of the other parties is likely to agree to any kind of an effective ceasefire or a permanent settlement in Bosnia is highly uncertain now. It comes under the rubric, I would say, not of secrets, which exist somewhere and which we might be able to obtain by one way or another, but mysteries. And on whether or not something positive can be brought about there by negotiation, I think your guess is as good as mine. Yes, sir, you had a question.
What's the situation that you can go into the Kurds in the northern part of Iraq, and then they go to Turkey, and I understand they get a lot of discrimination there.
The situation with respect to the Kurds in northern Iraq and also in Turkey. The Kurdish people have the misfortune of being present in a number of different countries in the Mideast, and they have, of course, historically over many years been involved in an effort to establish a nation, and their history goes back a lot longer than we have time to go into here today. In Turkey, there is some understandable dissatisfaction by some of the Kurds, but the principal reality is, I would say, a terrorist organization, the PKK, the Kurdish party that is involved in terrorist actions throughout Turkey, and indeed has been involved in terrorism in Western Europe and in other countries as well against Turkish governmental structures, airlines, and the rest. The situation is perhaps a little bit parallel to what existed until relatively recently in the Basque country of Spain, in which there was some understandable interest in Basque language and so forth on the part of the Basque people, but it was being exploited by a Basque terrorist organization that was killing a lot of people in Spain and acting against Spanish government installations outside Spain and the rest. The Spanish government has been largely successful over the course of the last several years in separating the terrorist operation of the Basques away from the understandable interest of people in the Basque country and being able to speak their language and so forth. We can all hope, of course, that some evolution of that type will occur in Turkey as well. Yes, sir.
What is the difference between the nuclear threat that we're seeing in North Korea versus Iraq, or is there a difference?
What's the difference between the nuclear threat in North Korea and Iraq? Iraq would probably have had a nuclear weapon by now had the Gulf War not occurred. Under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which both Iraq and North Korea are signatories to, There has been for some years a procedure for inspection of declared sites by the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, in Vienna. The IAEA was inspecting the Iraqi nuclear program, its declared reactors and the rest, and found nothing of great substance to concern itself about. And then during and following the Gulf War, the rest of the world learned that Saddam Hussein had an entirely separate nuclear program going on in secret facilities. Instead of using reactors, he was using devices called calutrons to produce fissionable material. This is a very old technology. It's one the United States abandoned in 1943, 1944. Extremely inefficient, but you can get enough fissionable material for a few nuclear weapons out of it if you engage in it vigorously enough. Saddam was doing that. He was caught as a result of the Gulf War, and consequently the IAEA began a policy of inspecting not only declared sites but also non-declared sites, so-called special inspections or challenge inspections. One of the issues outstanding with North Korea now in the discussions between them and the IAEA in the situation in which they are negotiating with the IAEA about these inspections is ultimately going to be both whether they will permit inspections, full inspections at their declared facilities, and that's the issue that's currently on the table. Even if that is resolved, in order to get some kind of a reasonable overall handle on the North Korean nuclear program, it would be necessary for them to go further and be able to undertake inspections at so-called challenge or special inspections. The intelligence community's assessment today, I think, as I said, is that it's more likely than not that North Korea has enough fissionable material for at least one nuclear weapon. But that is not entirely free from doubt. There are different views about it even within the U.S. intelligence community. Yes, sir, back at the back.
I have a question as to the appeasement, policy of appeasement primarily towards North Korea as to the lack of economic embargo. And the second part of the question, why had our administration and our politicians backed off from allowing countries, free-loving countries, democracies, budding democracies in Eastern Europe, such as Poland and others, to be admitted to NATO rather than maybe take the risk of offending Mr. Yeltsin? And some of the Russians that are not exactly loving democracy.
Well, you persist in asking me policy questions as if I were a policymaker. I don't intend to say much about either of these, except I would certainly dispute the characterization of American policy now vis-a-vis North Korea as appeasement. It is quite the contrary, been a rather vigorous effort through negotiations to get them to comply with their obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And the Partnership for Peace initiative, which not only the United States but all of the other NATO allies are operating in support of now, is a phased and gradual approach toward working with Eastern European countries as well as other countries of the former Soviet Union, and I'm going to leave it to the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense to characterize that in detail. But it is a general and throughout NATO now, I think, a highly accepted approach toward dealing with the difficult situation in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. Yes, sir.
Yes, could you speak a little bit on China's part in negotiating with Korea and Iraq and Iran, and also what you think China's position is in the world?
China's position in the world and China's part in negotiating with North Korea, Iran, and Iraq. China is economy grew at extraordinarily 12-13% last year, and at its projected growth rates, if those or even something slightly less continues, it will be one of the 2 or 3 largest economies in the world very early in the 21st century. Its only real problem economically is that this growth has occurred so quickly that the inflation rate is reasonably high, probably over 20%. That's per year, however, unlike some countries which have problems of inflation rates of that per month, or unlike Serbia, whose inflation rate in the last 2.5 years has been up a factor of a quadrillion. But nonetheless, even a 20% inflation rate is something to be concerned about. Generally speaking, I would say that our assessment of China's economic prospects and prospect for political stability is reasonably positive. It's not free from doubt. It's not free from uncertainty. There are certainly human rights problems in China, but its evolution economically is something that is viewed, I would say, in the intelligence community in relatively bright terms. China has been engaged to some extent in proliferation of weapons, not principally and not really to the countries you named, but we have been somewhat concerned about some of their permitted shipments from Chinese entities to other countries in the Mideast, particularly Pakistan. But it is not the same kind of proliferation problem that one has with North Korea, which is, in North Korea's case, that both in terms of its manufacturing of or efforts to produce weapons of mass destruction and ballistic missiles, and also its very vigorous efforts to sell its military capabilities overseas, is engaged in this in a somewhat single-minded way. In China, the proliferation problem is not that substantial, but it is something that still concerns us, and it's something that we watch closely and are, of course, continually involved in discussions with the Chinese about.
We have one more. Let's take this back over there.
Let's take 2. We'll take the one you pointed to and the one Dan pointed to. Back here, yes, sir.
With the end of the Cold War and kind of the emphasis shifting on to more economic confrontation around the world, do you see the role of your agency in moving maybe away from the gathering of military or political information and more to the role of business or economic information as a weapon of support for the United States?
Did everybody hear the question? At the end, after the end of the Cold War, do I see the CIA as moving away from focusing on political or military intelligence and toward economic intelligence? The answer is not moving away from military and political, particularly in the countries which, for whom military and politics is a very hidden and closed and potentially dangerous situation, such as North Korea, Iran, Iraq, Libya. In a number of countries of the world, political reporting can now be done heavily based upon open sources. Russia is an example. We used to have people involved in criminology and figuring out what it meant if so-and-so was standing next to such and such on top of Lenin's tomb for the October Revolution celebration, or what did it mean that Mr. Beria did not go to the opera? Occasionally this was mocked. There was a famous editorial once in the New York Times saying that some criminologists thought it was important that Beria didn't go to the opera. Well, maybe Mr. Beria didn't like the opera. Beria was Stalin's head of the KGB. Well, a few days after he didn't go to the opera, he was out and done for. And so those types of things were important and interesting and useful. But today, if you want to follow most aspects of Russian politics, you buy Russian newspapers, watch Russian television. So with respect to a number of countries in the world, there is a degree of openness that lets us understand, us and the rest of the world, understand what's going on politically with considerably less effort at trying to obtain clandestine information than was the case before. In economics, the CIA has always been involved in trying to help the U.S. government understand such things as wheat crops in Russia, oil reserves in various parts of the world, trends in technology, currency flows, in order for the U.S. government to be able to make policies that were important to that end. In recent years, economics has come up on the front burner in several other ways. The increased use of sanctions, for example, well, against Libya, against Serbia, against Iraq, means that we need to understand in some detail the economies of those countries to understand how and in what way the countries are being affected by sanctions. And we also try to do forecasts that help our trade negotiators understand what things they should emphasize and the like. The thing that is probably a bit different now, and is one of the things that moves economics up to the front burner for us, is something that I alluded to in my opening remarks, which is that there are a number of countries in the world against whom American corporations compete, that both the foreign countries and the foreign companies are heavily involved in trying to win contracts around the world by bribery and other devices that are not available to American corporations because of the much higher traditions of business ethics, frankly, in this country, and also because of the Federal Corrupt Practices Act and all sorts of things which keep American companies from operating that way. One thing we do, and do increasingly, is help not American companies, but help the U.S. government understand when such efforts at bribery are going on, so that we can let the State Department know, and the ambassador can then go call on the foreign minister or the king or the president of that foreign country where the bribery is occurring, and can say something such as, I regret to inform you that we have very sound information that your telecommunications minister or your aviation minister is on the take. And the United States thinks this contract that is under consideration should be considered on a level playing field and not based upon the bribe either that he has just received or is about to receive. That sort of thing, given the position of importance of the United States in the world, tends to have a rather bracing effect in a lot of countries. And we are engaged in learning about such efforts at foreign bribery and helping the U.S. government to take corrective actions. A lot of the times the companies that we've been able to help get substantial contracts. As a result of that, 99 times out of 100, they never know that we were engaged. And indeed, sometimes recently they have taken strong public positions saying that the CIA should not be engaged in anything related to economics. That's fine with us. That's the way the intelligence system works in a democracy. There was one final question over here, Dan. You were pointing to someone. Could take it. Yes, sir.
You mentioned Libya several times.
Yes.
What is the current posture and threat from Libya?
Libya is hurting economically because of the sanctions, including particularly the sanctions on aircraft flights. And it is, I think, increasingly, Colonel Gaddafi is in a somewhat weaker position there. There is a good deal of economic deprivation and some degree of social dissatisfaction, even occasionally a bit of unrest in Libya. But it is probably going to continue in the state that it is in for some time. It could rejoin the civilized world if Colonel Gaddafi were willing to comply with the UN resolution that relates particularly to the two individuals who have been accused of bombing the Pan Am aircraft. If he were to turn them over either to the United States or the UK for trial and to cease all international support for terrorism and the other 2 or 3 items of that sort that are in the UN resolution, he could again be able to conduct international commerce and international relations on the basis that many other countries in the world are. But so far he's been unwilling to do that. The Libyans keep seeking some way out which will not require them to turn these people over. And right now we are at an impasse, and frankly I think our staying power is going to be better than his. Thank you.
CIA Director James Woosley is completing his first year as head of the nation's intelligence agency. From 1989 to 1991, Director Woosley served as U.S. representative to the negotiation on conventional armed forces in Europe.